I think Bitcoin is obviously very key to their plans, but they need Bitcoin to stay, as Larry Fink said, a technology for asset storage. They refuse to have it be a currency. And actually, Jeffrey Epstein gave an interview about Bitcoin, and he says the exact same thing Larry Fink says. It's not a currency. It's, a technology for asset. Bitcoin is kept in that box that people like Larry Fink and Jeffrey Epstein and people like them, Larry Summers, presumably, who was on the Zappo advisory board, these guys want Bitcoin to be a specific thing because they can use it.
The release of the Epstein-related records has triggered a wave of tension across the Bitcoin and cryptocurrency landscape. Millions of pages are now being dissected by journalists, lawmakers, and industry observers, revealing how Jeffrey Epstein attempted to position himself near emerging technology sectors. Within those documents, Bitcoin is referenced extensively, alongside repeated mentions of blockchain and cryptocurrency. The scale of those references alone has been enough to unsettle parts of the market and reignite debates many believed were long settled. The disclosures have intensified scrutiny around early-stage investments, philanthropic funding, and the pathways through which influence often flows in frontier industries. For a community that prides itself on decentralization and independence, the reappearance of familiar names, developers, founders, institutions, venture figures inside controversial archives has created visible discomfort. Sentiment has shifted in pockets of the market. Trust, perception, and narrative are once again colliding with price action. Crucially, appearance within these records does not establish wrongdoing, knowledge of misconduct, or participation in criminal activity. Historical documents capture contact, references, forwarded communications, and proposed introductions, not conclusions. Yet markets rarely wait for nuance. Reputational uncertainty alone can shape psychology, and psychology, as always, shapes markets. Whitney Webb's analysis approaches this turbulence from a radically different angle. Rather than framing these revelations as a critique of Bitcoin, she interprets them as evidence of something more fundamental: early recognition of Bitcoin's importance by powerful networks. In her view, the core issue is not contamination, but competition. Why figures connected to finance, capital, and elite institutions would view Bitcoin not merely as an asset, but as critical infrastructure. If you value clear, independent, thought-provoking analysis, take a second to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your perspective in the comments. Thanks, and enjoy the video.
I know that people like the whole idea of, we need the political savior to come save us. Let's get the right guy in the White House. What a mess our whole country is. We need to get the right guy in the White House. The guy in the White House is always a front for the bankers, and it's pretty much always been that way. The CIA itself, it's the bankers. If you look at the early CIA, it was all bankers. It was Wall Street lawyers out of Sullivan and Cromwell. That's who's been doing this the whole time. And now they're enslaving the planet with spy satellites. And they're the spies, So, I don't know. I just get so tired of the election rhetoric sometimes. People just really need to understand that this is the bankers. They run the public sector. They run the private sector. This is a financial slavery system. It's the slavery system they've been using for decades, but on steroids. And in Latin America, their big focus is to integrate Argentina and Brazil. They want to do the same thing to South America that they did to Europe to create the European Union, which is start with a free trade agreement for all of Europe. That's how the EU started. It evolves into this bureaucratic totalitarian behemoth, and it's yoked to the US through the Eurodollar. They're doing the same thing in Latin America. There's all these different iterations of it, right-leaning and left-leaning, which are basically all globalist governance, attempts integrate South America at the regional level. There's ProSur, there's Mercosur, there's UNISUR, there's ALADI, there's all these different acronyms. There's the Organization of American States. The goal of all of these, one way or another, is to regionally integrate, whether it's under right-leaning dialectics or left-leaning dialectics. That's what they want. And they want a free trade of the Americas, so not just NAFTA. That was the North American one, right? They want one for all of the Americas. They want to regionally integrate all of the Americas at the economic level, lead it down this path towards bureaucratic regional governance to be part of this global governance patchwork thing, which has been, the push for arguably a very, 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 very long time. And they want to do it with spy satellites and all this other stuff going on. But the idea is to do that same model used in the EU, but they want to yoke it with dollar stable coins, not the euro dollar necessarily. And so the Argentina, Brazil and Argentina are the ones they need to have most under their thumb because they're the biggest countries in size of South America. You get Brazil and Argentina, you basically get the whole continent. So my concern is you're going to have them try and do it the right-leaning way through people like Javier Milei, and if they get him back in power, Bolsonaro, and frame them as, they're defeating the baddies, but really they're just, they're the other hand, like we discussed earlier. And what's interesting too is like a lot of this group that's discussed in the Green Plus piece, RSK, the satellite firm, and some of the connective tissue between them that includes, Zappa, Wince Casares, and these figures are essentially like the Argentinian branch of the PayPal mafia. A lot of their companies were funded and directed by this entity that Mark mentioned earlier called Endeavor, which is chaired right now by Edgar Bronfman Jr., who, if you've read my book, you'll know a lot about the Bronfmans and organized crime and political power. They're, for example, the family that essentially bankrolled Justin Trudeau in Canada, among other figures. And they're very powerful. Reid Hoffman of the PayPal Mafia and LinkedIn and whatnot, also a very close Epstein pal, is also very intimately tied up with Endeavor. And the companies that Endeavor helped create are some of the biggest companies in Latin America now. Many of them are based in Argentina. The biggest one, of course, is based in Argentina, the first Endeavor success story, which would be Mercado Libre. Which is Marcos Galperin, who, as Mark mentioned earlier, he's on the board of Satellogic, involved with a lot of these other companies. Mercado Libre itself is very much interfaced with Paxos, PayPal, and groups like that. And it's sort of like what happened earlier, what I mentioned earlier about those figures sort of king making the corporate titans of Latin America. So this is like a modern iteration of that with like the same players. They're funding these startups and ensuring which companies get big and if they succeed, but they're, Endeavor's not an Argentinian entity. It's an entity run by people like Edgar Bronfman and Reid Hoffman. And so there's an Endeavor Argentina branch in pretty much all of these companies that we discuss in the piece that are based in Argentina are part of this Endeavor Argentina network. And Argentina is where I would argue, are going to test out a lot of these efforts, most likely under Milei, because he's very amenable to these kinds of policies. And so one of these figures that comes up a lot in the piece, this Diego Gutierrez, he's one of the co-founders of RSK, of Rootstock. He gave this very revealing interview about a year ago, and he was talking about several things that I think are important to bring up in the context of this interview. One of them is that as Bitcoin becomes integrated into Wall Street, Bitcoin has to shed its ethos, as he called it. Essentially, it has to stop being a tool of dissent, a threat to both commercial and central banks, and essentially become their tool. That's what he says. So for Bitcoin to succeed, in his eyes, that has to happen. So that's very telling. And then he also says that there's going to be a concerted push to move away from money printed by the state, meaning central banks, and instead move to commodity-backed stablecoins where the people that own the commodities will have all the power. I think that's very interesting. Because obviously Milei, in his case, right, came to power framing himself as very libertarian, but his policies thus far have shown him to be very crony capitalist, in my opinion. We've talked about this before, and Mark brought up some stuff, to that point. But keep in mind too that a lot of the people in his government are from J.P. Morgan, for example, or the Argentinian branch of major Wall Street banks. He's been very closey with people like Fink and Musk, as discussed, among others. And very friendly with like Zelensky and the Ukraine stuff. I mean, this is not a very libertarian guy under other metrics. And there's been a lot of, antagonism with him and Argentina's central bank, which of course is responsible for a lot of bad stuff that has happened in Argentina. But people also need to remember the history of how Argentina got here, which as a lot of this fiscal trouble for Argentina began when it was run by a U.S. and CIA-backed military coup, then under Carlos Menem, who was the great, I say this great not in the actually like, oh, that was great sense, like big, I guess, the big neoliberal in Argentina, recent political history, who was basically just like a goon for, U.S., foreign interests really to like gobble up Argentinian resources. Milei is a big fan of Menem, and some of his the people that are in his government started their political careers under Menem, like Patricia Bullrich, the interior minister, for example. So, you could really frame Milei as a continuation of that stuff, because Mauricio Macri, a lot of people in Milei's government are from the Macri government, especially his economics team. There's a direct line to all of that. And so I am very concerned that, that would be celebrated as like a big, yes, he's gonna, the central bank's not gonna print the peso anymore. It's over and he's saved Argentina. Well, is it really saving Argentina if he's, going to make, they're going to use dollar peg stable coins. They're regulating the cred of Bitcoin right now. They're going to move to this whole model of commodity-backed stablecoins, which is already actually happening in Argentina. A company backed by Visa that's based in Argentina is tokenizing basically all of the country's grain deposits to use that as currency. So whoever owns all of the grains, and the biggest landowner is a big former backer of Mauricio Macri, part of Endeavor Argentina. His name is Eduardo Elstein. He owns all of the commodities. He's also a big shareholder of some of Israel's biggest companies. He's going to be the guy that basically controls the money then, right? At least with the grain-backed stable coins. So if you have all these oligarchs in charge of different industries, which is essentially what Argentina has been becoming and has been happening really everywhere around the world, who's going to be in charge of the money? Is that really better than the central bank having it? Because remember, the central bank's run by the commercial banks. So you're just getting, the same shit under a different, name, basically. I don't know. There's a lot of different stuff going on here, and it's going to be interesting to see how it develops.
Whitney Webb's contribution reframes the entire controversy. While much of the current discourse fixates on names, associations, and reputational fallout, Whitney directs attention to something far more consequential: why Bitcoin attracted this level of interest in the first place. Her argument is not that Bitcoin was corrupted, but that it was identified early as strategically vital. According to Whitney, figures like Jeffrey Epstein and powerful financial actors did not gravitate toward Bitcoin out of ideological alignment. They were drawn to its structural properties: a global censorship-resistant ledger, a settlement layer outside direct state issuance, an immutable system capable of anchoring financial instruments at scale. In her analysis, Bitcoin was never invisible to elite networks. It was studied, mapped, and assessed as infrastructure long before the public recognized its implications. Whitney argues that this explains a persistent pattern: repeated attempts to redefine Bitcoin's role, to frame it as digital gold, property, or asset storage, while systematically discouraging its use as money. Not because Bitcoin failed as currency, but because a neutral, peer-to-peer monetary system is fundamentally incompatible with centralized financial control. In Whitney's words, Bitcoin becomes acceptable only once it sheds its disruptive ethos and is folded into existing power structures.
But the other side of this is what's happening in places like Argentina right now, where people have lost so much of their purchasing power. So like before Milei came to power, I think the poverty rate was just, it was insanely high. I think it was something like 60%. And then Milei came into power and devalued the currency by 50%, which led to a massive loss in purchasing power for Argentinians on top of that. Now Argentinians are so desperate and are being told that they're undergoing quote unquote shock therapy designed by a JP Morgan guy, that they're doing WorldCoin. They're scanning their eyes in the Sam Altman orb for shitcoins and a cattle tag, a digital ID. And the idea is to have that be like your access to the internet, and using, these tokens and these stable coins, using Tether, using USDC, whatever supported by Mercado Libre's giant entity, Mercado Pago, which is also integrated with Brazil's biggest crypto exchange, Mercado Bitcoin, and then there's Ripio in the mix, which is partnered with all of these guys too. They're going to control all the rails that stuff runs on. And that's where people are running because their money has been so devalued and they have no alternative. And I think that's ultimately the goal, is to get people on programmable, surveillable money by any means necessary. So if you won't do it because you're like, oh yeah, this is a way I'm going to use JP Morgan coin and beat the Fed CBDC. If you're not going to get suckered into that, then, it seems like they'll use destabilization and desperation as a way to get people to onboard into the systems that they're creating. They're not just going to spend billions of dollars creating these systems and have no one use them. They're going to try and use either, desperation created by public sector policies or by private sector policies, and then have, sort of like 2008. Oh, look, the private banks have destroyed the economy. Now we need the public sector to come in and rein them in, even though Obama's cabinet that was supposed to be doing that was literally chosen by Citigroup, right? They're the ones that are going to come in and they're going to rein these in, and these are the policies and changes that need to be made. But actually, it's the bankers that wrote the changes that need to be made, right? So we're likely going to get set up for something like that, where they're going to try and make like existing money worthless. And if you want your money to be worth anything and maintain any sort of semblance of purchasing power, you have to use financial products X, Y, and Z. And they're all going to be programmable and surveillable, if not by the private sector, by the public sector. And they're all going to be interoperable. They're going to be all these different wallets and digital ID systems that look like they're different companies, but they're all the same, essentially, in terms that they can export all their data to the same central global database. And, that's essentially the goal here. So how do we fight against that? Don't use the database. Don't use the digital wallet. Don't use the digital ID. Don't interact with the system. And I think also, I think Bitcoin is obviously very key to their plans, but they need Bitcoin to stay, as Larry Fink said, a technology for asset storage. They refuse to have it be a currency. And actually, Jeffrey Epstein gave an interview about Bitcoin that I didn't know about until maybe a couple months ago when we started researching this. Yep. Oh, yes. No and idea. He says the exact same thing Larry Fink says. It's not a currency. It's, a technology for asset storage. Basically, if Bitcoin is kept in that box that people like Larry Fink and Jeffrey Epstein and people like them, Larry Summers, presumably, who was on the Zappo advisory board, these guys want Bitcoin to be a specific thing because they can use it. And there's people in the space, like this RSK guy, saying Bitcoin needs to lose its revolutionary ethos. It's got to drop that and become a tool for Wall Street. I think it's pretty obvious what needs to be done to scuttle those plans, which would be ensure the opposite. If they need the Bitcoin blockchain for asset storage, and presumably, if we're right about what's going on in this article, which we seem to be, carbon markets, they need that blockchain. How do we invert their plans and use the Bitcoin blockchain so that it's the tool of financial freedom it was heralded to be, because they can't get rid of it without scuttling their own plans?
From this perspective, the current Epstein-related revelations take on a very different meaning. Rather than undermining Bitcoin's legitimacy, they reinforce its importance. Powerful actors do not attempt to influence irrelevant technologies. They move toward systems capable of reshaping markets, governance, and sovereignty. Whitney's work suggests Bitcoin was recognized as such a system from its earliest years. She also warns against a familiar historical cycle. Crisis creates desperation. Desperation accelerates adoption. Adoption invites control. Whitney points to regions experiencing monetary collapse as testing grounds for programmable money, stablecoins, and surveillance-linked financial infrastructure, systems presented as solutions, but designed to consolidate power rather than distribute it. In this context, Bitcoin occupies a unique position. It can serve as a genuine alternative, or be repurposed as a settlement layer beneath new forms of financial dominance. Whitney is explicit that this outcome is not predetermined. It depends on how Bitcoin is used, developed, and defended. Whether its open-source nature remains central, or whether convenience and institutional endorsement gradually erode its foundational principles. This is why Whitney does not frame these revelations as a reason to abandon Bitcoin. She frames them as a warning to guard it more carefully, to resist narratives that strip it of its monetary function, to recognize that attempts to co-opt Bitcoin are not evidence of failure, but of threat, perceived by those who stand to lose the most from a truly neutral financial system. If you found this analysis valuable, support the channel by liking the video, subscribing, and sharing your thoughts below. Do these revelations change how you view Bitcoin, or do they confirm why it matters? Thank you for watching.